Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. Also, check out the Kyndryl Institute that has many of the former guests on the show and future guests at kyndryl.com/institute. A bottle of wine sells for $80 in store. The restaurant charges $400. It still sells, and people go back for more. The sommelier tells them a story about a vineyard, about a sixth-generation family continuing a tradition. Some of it might be true, some of it doesn't really matter. The wine tastes better now. The diners think that they're paying for wine, but what they're actually paying for is the sommelier, his vibe, his wit, his ability to make them feel like connoisseurs. What really happens here is the sommelier is curating uncertainty. And we are joined today for an episode of Innovation Show X by two of the best content sommeliers in the world. It's a great pleasure to welcome first the author of Leap, a future guest on the show, a future deep dive on this book, Leap. Howard Yu, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And welcome back as well. I don't have a copy of his latest book, but I've read many excerpts, which is Reshuffle. But he's the author of this book as well, Platform Revolution. Sangeet Paul Choudary, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan.
It's an absolute pleasure to have both of you on the show. I was telling you off air, I listen to both of your Substacks every week. So for those of you who don't know, you can listen to Substack. And these two gents have brilliant Substacks. They put so much effort in. Howard actually puts it in his notes, 25 hours per article. And they're absolutely genius pieces of work. And I thought I'd pick one today and we'd see it from every perspective, because bringing them together where they've both studied the same cases but brought different perspectives is really unique. And I'm going to ask you first, Howard, I'm going to start with you to maybe say why this makes sense to actually do this episode with Sangeet. And then I'm going to come to Sangeet and see his perspective of why this makes sense. So over to you, Howard.
I mean, I came across Sangeet's work all the way back to his first book, but we actually never spoke. I sort of stalked him for his intellectual capacity all through this year. And it's only really Substack that bring us together, in the sense that I write long article, he writes long article. At some point, it's like, oh my God, I was just trying to understand this particular company called Adobe. What is going on? Because I remember back in Harvard Business School, everyone praises how much Adobe is able to transform itself. And we're getting into the detailed description and story later. But now they are in a second cliff all over again. So I was scratching my head and trying to understand whether Adobe can reinvent itself. And Sangeet's, books, Reshuffle, and also his Substack just flew off the lap onto me. It's like, the answer is here. And then as a result, I have a fabulous article as a result because of his inspiration. And then we start talking.
I'm the same. So I found the backstory you gave to Adobe, and we're going to get into this case, actually, Adobe and Figma. And the fact that, and Howard puts it beautifully, that you need a third act. Sometimes you'll survive a second act, but the third act can catch you off guard. Sangeet, to you now, let's share a little bit of your perspective and your understanding as well of Howard's work, because you see it from a totally different perspective.
Howard is too kind with his compliment. I've been following his work as well ever since Leap came out. And I've been stalking him on LinkedIn as well over the past few months, where he's actually got a really nice rhythm going and showing good thought leadership. So a lot of what I've been inspired by is just this idea of how to think about what makes a company future ready. And I think Howard started bringing out this with his work on Leap, and now even more so with his Future Readiness Index. And I think the reason that's interesting to me is because I look a lot at industry structure. I think about future readiness more from a perspective of what do you need to be ready for, right? And I believe that Howard looks at it from the perspective of how do you get ready for it. And I think that's super interesting for me because it helps me feed back a lot into my work as well, because the the capabilities that a company brings to the table and the structure of the industry within which those capabilities create competitive advantage, they are not independent of each other. They are interdependent. So they constantly feed each other. As a company innovates, the industry structure changes. As the industry structure changes, the company has to innovate in response. And so I think that complementarity is there in our work as well.
Because what Sangeet just described, I remember Clay Christensen at one point, the father who coined the terminology of disruptive technology and disruptive innovation. I'm sure many listeners in the show would recognize his name. But I remember in the doctoral seminar, students beginning to ask, since this popularity of the notion of disruptive innovation has getting so much traction in the business world, does it change manager thinking about disruption? And after some deep thought, it does. It does, because the moment people recognize here is a new thing that we can no longer ignore, it just accelerates the clock speed. Obviously, technology moves faster, but also its managerial practices move faster as well, because people now know a new entrant coming in, doing something cheap and low end. Well, we better be prepared now. So like Sangeet just mentioned, it actually feed to one another at the industry level.
And just for those who don't know, that Howard studied with Joe Bauer as well. So those of you who joined us for the Joe Bauer series, the recognition of Joe Bauer, Howard had Joe Bauer as a mentor and a thesis advisor, right, Howard?
Yes, and I remember he is actually the one who read through my first draft of my dissertation and was like, your grammar mistakes are quite astounding. So I'm going to send you to the dissertation workshop just to work through your writing skills. So it was such an interesting and humbling experience. Who would have thought going for doctoral degrees, you end up just working through your writing skills?
Well, it's paid off, man. It's totally paid off, and it paid off in Leap. Let's just, last thing before we get stuck into this case. And Howard, I'd love you to give the backstory, because that's what you do in your article. You go right back to an inflection point for Adobe where they actually survived the first act to the second act, that leap. But maybe the titles of your book, because you didn't just pick them because they'd sell on the shelves. You picked them because they mean something meaningful. And it also speaks to the different ways you attack the world or see the world from an educational perspective, working with executives and anybody who's learning from you. So maybe we'll start with, Howard, your perspective of Leap and the way you come at content and work. And then Sangeet, the way you see this reshuffling, this great reshuffling that we're seeing today.
Sure. I mean, in my work, I am really curious about organizations that are outliers, the opposite side of disruptive innovation. That why there would be outlier company could survive through centuries. And what I have learned, say the world of pharmaceutical, Roche, Novartis, Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, these are century-old companies. Now, in Switzerland, it doesn't exactly scream tech playground. And I think more people living in Greater London as well. It's a tiny nation. And so conventional wisdom would suggest Swiss farmer would have no chance facing disruptive innovation. The Japanese, the South Korean, the Saudis, the Chinese all want to enter this industry. Easy. The Swiss should have zero chance. And yet 2 centuries later, they still lead. So in the Leap book, I was trying to explore the opposite side of disruptive innovation in a way. Why would there are outlier can continue to thrive through centuries? Procter & Gamble too. Low technology. Disposable diapers, laundry detergent, my God, 150 years in consumer packaged goods. Not the Japanese, not the South Korean again, could disrupt them. So that is the opening of the book Leap. And if you ask me one bumper stickers, what is the key takeaway? Well, you need to leap to the new knowledge discipline in order to stay future ready. If you don't incorporate new capabilities over time, if you don't jump from one old knowledge to the new knowledge, like microbiology to genomics, for instance, then the company is really numbered. So it is doable. Then, of course, the key question is how.
We're going to cover this book. So on your Christmas list from Santa, make sure Leap is on there. Make sure Reshuffle is on there, because Reshuffle is going to be there. We're also going to do a deep dive on Platform Revolution as well, Sangeet's other book. Sangeet, maybe we'll talk about the concept of reshuffle, because You build this into all your writing as well. The word reshuffle comes up quite a lot, and it's not to mention the book. It is a reshuffling that we're seeing of skills, of capabilities, of much, much more.
Aidan, I wrote Reshuffle for our current moment in AI, but I believe that a lot of the lessons from Reshuffle apply across the board for any technological shift at any point in time. And what really prompted me to write Reshuffle, and that also explains why that word is important, is that when I wrote Platform Revolution, I was trying to answer a simple question. What's fundamentally different about digital business models? What separates the winners from the losers? And in order to condense and simplify that message, I focused on the idea of platforms. Over the years that followed, I realized that everybody was starting to use platform as a silver bullet, that you had to become a platform in order to succeed. And the truth is never quite like that. You don't win in business with these simple rules of thumb. And so I wanted to bring out this key idea that when technological shifts happen, you don't just speed up things, you don't just automate things, you don't just change channels from physical to digital, you actually rewire the entire system. And the new system looks nothing like the old system. The ways you play in the new system, the games you play, the way you compete fundamentally changes, which also then changes who wins and who loses. So you really see this unbundling of the old system and rebundling of a new system. This happens at every level, at the level of workflow, at the level of organizations, at the level of business models. But what ends up happening as a result is that there's a reordering of players in terms of who wins and who loses. And that's the idea of a reshuffle.
We're set up now, guys. We're set up. Let's get stuck into this case, which is not only about Adobe, but it's about the new player in town, Figma. And Howard, I'm going to come to you. I have a little quote to set you up beautifully, the way you do where you open this article. The lights dimmed at Adobe Max 2013 in Los Angeles. 5,000 designers and photographers leaned forward. On stage, CEO Shantanu Narayan adjusted his glasses and dropped a bombshell. There will be no Creative Suite 7, he declared. No more boxed software, no more one-time licenses. From that day on, Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign would only exist in the cloud. People gasped. People went to Twitter. They complained. They said they were going to boycott Adobe. But soon the entire ecosystem shifted. This was the jump from Act 1 to Act 2. Cue the stage. Howard, you.
Well, it is a major shift for Adobe at the time, and it's hard to remember now, but once upon a time, we might remember we used software buying from boxes, right? DVD RAW, we call it. And it was at the time that all the software basically are in boxes, whether it's Microsoft operating system, Windows, you buy your HP or Dell computer, it's loaded, it's perpetual licenses. And so Adobe historic business model is selling boxes. And now, by then, around the corner, there is this whole broadband is coming along, and there are software as services like Salesforce.com is coming along. What triggered Adobe as Act 1 of a transformation is the financial crisis. Because the financial crisis back then at around 2008-ish causes Adobe to bleed so much cash because people are no longer buying the upgrade. Now, if you are the traditional software company back then, you sell boxes of software. The moment your individual designers, remember, graphic designers, a lot of them are freelancers. When they're under tight belt, they stop buying the next upgrade. And this is when Adobe, for the first time, experienced a tremendous loss in their corporate history. So they cut staff and so on. But the CEO looking at the CFO and said, we actually messed it up. It's our responsibility. Because looking across the street, you have Salesforce still thriving. Because from day one, they were born cloud-based. Everything is subscription. So people continue to pay and they have a much more steady cash flow. Unlike Adobe, go through cyclicality. So out of that realization, the heroic effort coming in, they really need to move the company from a perpetual license model into much more a subscription model. Now, notice that back then, Microsoft is still selling perpetual license. They were the first one who invented or transformed into a subscription model from a historic business model. And boy, just to convince financial Wall Street, it is such a tough sales. So that is the very first Act 1 where they were. and able to move into Act 2 to become a cloud-based first, subscription-driven organization.
Before we come to Sangeet, I thought the really nice part about this, and the piece people don't usually know, was the experiment, which was the Australia experiment. Let's share that as well. And a nice segue to Sangeet's approach to Reshuffle was it wasn't just a price change, it was a total organizational rewiring. I think that's an important thing to just share, Howard, before we come to Sangeet, because that is not often thought about. What does this mean? What does it mean to our sales teams? Do people get rewarded for selling once or for recurring revenue? All this kind of stuff. CFOs need to be involved. The whole organization needs to change how it works in order to accommodate.
That's right. And even the product team, right? Because in the past, you think about an organizational cadence. When you sell perpetual licenses, it's like a fashion house. Okay, next 5 years plan, and this is the big new shiny thing. Remember Windows Vista? Oh boy, what a disaster, right? So they were in that world. They were gearing up with this go ahead, point of no return, make it perfect, and then life is good. To a subscription model that you're talking about every day, every month, every week, we're going to have feature, performance boost, bug fix, and listening to user, what is their usage pattern, and we're going to iterate. So from a product angle, is a fundamental rewiring of the organization. Like you said, the sales team would be different. The existing relationship, no longer depending on big distributor, but going all the way to end users as marketing and sales and support, and the user community as well, bulletin board and all that, require fundamental rewiring within the organization. This is why people oftentimes think, oh, it's just a pricing change. No, it's not a pricing change. This is a rewiring of the company so that it becomes subscription first, cloud-based organization.
And an entire change to the mindset of that organization as well, which brings us to Sangeet, because Sangeet, you come in at this point to say, why couldn't Adobe, with all its resources, billions in the bank, really well valued, the incumbent, why couldn't it have a change? It had the talent, the cash, the incentive. Collaboration isn't a deep trade secret that its competitor now, Figma, came along. And it saw Figma coming. It saw it coming. It even tried to acquire it. And what we say often in innovation, and why I was so interested to bring you both on air, is the answers to this question circle back to well-worn tropes. Incumbents are slow, startups are fast, ideas are cheap, execution is the differentiator. And I love what you say here, Sangeet. These explanations are, in a phrase, true, but utterly useless. The examples of what you've previously called consensus theater. So over to you to take it on from here.
Yeah, exactly. I think Adobe is such an interesting example because it sort of works against the logic of the slow incumbent. Adobe was not a slow incumbent, as Howard just demonstrated. They did everything right that you need to do to transform in the face of a technological shift. So they got all of those things right. They even killed their traditional revenue models, successfully transitioned to new revenue models. What's very interesting about Adobe, when people think about the difference between Adobe and Figma, they often boil it down to Figma was really good at collaboration. But as you pointed out, Aidan, what's so complex about collaboration? Why can't you copy collaboration? And the reason for that is that when a new technological shift happens, it allows a fundamentally new architecture for business. And a very simple way to understand that is to look at the difference between Adobe and Figma in terms of how they're architected. Adobe as a business is architected around the logic of a design file. So everything happens around the design file. A designer works on the design file. Adobe's product improvements are constantly about improving the performance in the design file and then ensuring that whoever then has to work with it gets a very high fidelity design delivered. So Adobe is structured around the logic of a design file. Figma, because it is cloud native and came up after the cloud, it's structured around the logic of an element in the file. So a button, a specific type of element that would be there in any design file. It's structured at that level. And it sounds theoretical, but the reason this is so important is because when you can manage individual elements in a design file, you can manage those elements across different workflows where those elements have to be reused. And in an organization, you typically need to reuse elements to be brand consistent. So you make a button look a certain way, you want it to look a certain way across the board wherever it has to be used. And so organizations could now use Figma's shared libraries where every element could be shared across the organization. Now, that in itself is interesting, but it leads to very interesting effects on top of that. So the first obvious effect is that design is not just about executing an idea and creating a design file. It's about feeding into a workflow where that design then gets used towards creating value downstream in some way, whether it's a marketing workflow or it's a product workflow. And what Figma was able to do was, because it was cloud first, it was able to create a collaboration environment where these workflows could work seamlessly. And so, in a way, Adobe continued to serve designers on execution. Figma served designers, engineers, marketers, everybody on collaboration. But more importantly, because the individual elements could be addressed and managed across the organization, it did not stop at collaboration. It went to the second and much more important lever of value. It enabled organization-wide governance. And that governance extended beyond just the limits of a design silo in the organization. It extended across the board. And governance is really important because one of the key factors, and I talked about this in Reshuffle as well, one of the key things that holds knowledge work back is just a lack of coordination within the organization. And if you can work off shared libraries, if you can govern things at the level of the individual element, then you're able to govern activity across the organization. And this in turn becomes interesting because even when Adobe opens its platform out to external partners versus Figma opens its platform out to external partners, a tool integrating into Figma can go in and make changes at the element level. A tool integrating into Adobe can only move files around. So that's a very significant difference. The quality of the partner ecosystem that you can create is very different, even if the nature or the names, the brand names and logos of the partners are the same. The types of workflows you can enable across partners is fundamentally different. So that completely changes industry structure. And I want to just tie this out by making one point, which I think is less appreciated and understood, but I think will become increasingly important as we move forward. We often think of disruptive innovation as something coming from Clayton Christensen, right? But Clayton Christensen proposed what is called the demand side theory of disruptive innovation. It's about how market behavior is changing, how you're looking to target a different customer segment. Alongside Christensen, while at HBS, there were three other professors working on what is now called the supply side theory of disruptive innovation or disruption, but is not very well known. And this is Henderson, Clark, and Baldwin. And the reason I believe the supply side theory is not very well known is because Christensen came out with his theory in 1997. And that is when the internet was coming out. And from 97 onwards till the early 2010s, most of innovation happened at the level of the customer interface, because that is where the internet and digital technologies first had an impact. The 2010s onwards, that impact extended across the value chain, driving modularity across the value chain, leading to microservices, leading to fundamentally different structures on the supply side. And now that we have AI is an input into value chains. So most of innovation today is no longer just at the level of the customer interface. And so increasingly, the demand side theory of Christensen is, I won't say it's not relevant, but it's insufficient to explain all of innovation today. We need to increasingly apply the supply side theory as well. And if you really unpack what I talk about in Reshuffle, it's inspired by the work of Henderson, Clark, and Baldwin from that perspective. And I think that is the key theory and the key idea that explains why Adobe could never copy Figma. It had nothing to do with the user base. It had nothing to do just with changing the use case. It was fundamentally about a new architecture.
Tim Clark is a friend of the show. He's been on a couple of times, and he pointed me towards all that idea of modularity and explosion of the product, really. And Howard, maybe not everybody understands Figma. They will see it increasingly, that's for sure. But they may understand Spotify. Maybe you'll pick it up from there.
If we think about the day-to-day life of a designer, if you are using Adobe, of course, it's fantastic product features and you could make your graphic, the icon, right? Let's imagine you're Spotify. You launch an app. Of course, you need to pick a right button and, the user interface, and you design all of it. The way you pass on to your manager for approval, who is not a coder, how do you do it? Well, you save in a file. and you forward through Dropbox, whatever. And that is what Sangeet talked a little bit around this coordination problem or the governance. Because what happened there is still a lot of manual hands-on. And by the way, for most of the S&P 500 company I've spoke to, this is still the way we work in 2025, a lot of manual handoff. Figma, you could think about as everything Google Doc. Everything is shared real time. So that collaboration is one version of truth out there. You don't need to email people. You don't need to download. You don't need to do version tracking, etc. So Figma born from that architecture from day one. And so for Spotify, what they have discovered as a Spotify team, and by the way, Uber experienced the same thing, all of a sudden they want to launch a new thing. They try Figma, it's no more email back and forth. Everything is real time. And all the stakeholders from right away, right off the bat, from the get-go, could have perfect visibility, perfect traceability, and whatever micro element of input, let's say approving this button color, or, oh, this font I don't really like. Oh, could you make this font bigger? They could manipulate in a shared version right away. Now, it sounds like a product feature element, but it's not. Because Sangeet just described, it basically is about how we govern decision-making processes more transparent way. And the artifact, meaning, the work that you're trying to do, the interface you're trying to launch at Spotify, becomes so one version of truth with full visibility, as a result, full accountability, by the way. And never mind about the speed. And now you lay AI on top. It's no longer just making your AI task to be more efficient. But in the very near future, you could optimize the workflow, and that will become the huge productivity gain, that we are able to automate decision-making right much faster than your competitor. So I always call this 1 inch ahead. You don't need to have the crystal ball, but boy, when Sangeet tell you something, we better be 1 inch ahead of our competition. This is how you win.
And that governance, I thought as well, Sangeet, you talked about the fact that the government changes who pays for the product. I thought this was interesting because we see this in our work when we work with executives. Sometimes they're like going, who can I get to pay for this? And when that goes up a level, it actually takes the heat off that department and it makes it much more likely to be recurring revenue going forward.
Absolutely. I think what Figma versus Adobe illustrates, as Howard was mentioning, is that a lot of wasted work in enterprises is not done at the point of execution. It's done more at the point of coordination. And in the case of Figma versus Adobe, there are many coordination failures that happen. You could have versioning issues, different people making different changes on different files. That goes away because it's cloud first. But more importantly, the bigger governance piece is who is responsible for what. So who can change the color of that button, or who can change how this particular wireframe should look. All of those things are managed within Figma as a governance layer. And what that does is it solves problems which are not just important for the designer, it solves problems which are important for whoever wants to get the entire workflow executed end to end, right? And that is typically a different office, because design is typically an input into many different workflows. You might have a head of marketing, a CMO, and design might be entering their workflows. You might have a head of product and design might be entering their workflows. And so when you try to sell Figma, or which part of the organization pays for Figma eventually is about which part of the organization sees the value the most. And that's the part that sits closest to the outcomes of those workflows. And that's why it fundamentally changes not just the customer or the user, it also changes the wallet from which money comes to Figma.
And Sangeet, I would love to ask a follow-up question there, because, this shift of governance is really profound. What is the enabler behind? Is it because of broadband? Is it just the bandwidth, real-time and connectivity, so that whether you're on mobile phone and whatever, or it is the user interface is more friendly so that the CFO can now be also a little more tacky, and with ChatGPT, like the barrier to technical work is lower? What is the enabler, the way you think through that allows reshuffle to happen?
If you really think about it, you execute individual tasks, but you very often govern workflows, organizational systems, processes And typically what that takes you from tasks to processes, workflows, and organizational systems, the glue that takes you from one to the other is essentially interoperability or connectivity and decision-making power or intelligence. And the two biggest and most profound technological shifts of the past 15 years, cloud computing and AI, directly impact these two things. Because prior to the cloud, you could not manage end-to-end workflows. Even if every single task in that workflow was provided by the same company, and we know those companies, Oracle, SAP of the 1990s, even if they provided every single product, the workflow had to be very strictly defined, which meant that very often it would not work for most organizations. So much of the coordination would happen outside it. But what happens with the cloud first is because you can now modularize software in the sense that on the cloud, because of having cloud hosted software, you don't need to sell everything to the enterprise. You could sell just one small task execution. You could sell one small thing like customer onboarding. You don't need to sell the end-to-end customer management and still be profitable because the cost of serving it over the internet is very low, which essentially meant that companies, essentially vendors, software vendors, became progressively more niche and focused and started doing individual tasks very well and opening up their APIs so that they could connect across all other players who were solving adjacent tasks in the workflow. So the first level of workflow connectivity happened because of this ability to open up APIs, this ability to modularize and work with anybody else who was really good at solving adjacent tasks. But the second piece, even if you do that, you still need a lot of intelligence. You still need to make decisions. You still need to see things across the board. That was still broken. And with improvements in AI, that's where the current bet is. And I talk about this in some of my recent writing. The idea of what we today call agentic workflows is not just to speed up existing tasks within a workflow, but to really think what are the decisions and the assumptions around which a workflow is structured to achieve an outcome, and how could we reorient the workflow and solve it? So because of these two things, governance becomes really important. I'll just take a couple of quick examples, right? If you look at a company like Stripe, Stripe is a payments company. That's what you would think. But because it modularizes the payment, it allows payments to be managed at an individual API level. It then manages the governance of those payments as well. Which payments can be approved by which part of the organization? And how do these payments stack up internally into different reports? So it moves away from simply executing payments, which actually is being done by the rest of the value chain. Stripe is abstracting that away. And most of the value that Stripe creates on top is in the governance of the flow of money. And so those are examples where you really see that the combination of the shift to cloud computing and then the current shift to AI constantly shifts us away from execution into governance-based business models.
Howard, do you want to come back in, or are you okay?
I'm good. I mean, this is such a solving a big mystery always in my mind.
It's great. And actually, I don't know if you guys saw ChatGPT have now integrated with Figma, which and the stock soared 12% as a result of that API. Just opening up the API and understanding, so you can actually create sketches and it will turn it into diagrams now using ChatGPT.
Wow.
So just bringing it from one act to the next. And I thought Howard would share what you say here, because I want to come back to the Adobe moment. Adobe, to me, I used to celebrate Adobe. I used to think they were so good. They managed Wall Street. They managed that downturns. They did just everything right. And you're going, why? Because we want, with our work, we want people to succeed. It's one of the reasons I do the show. And you say zoom out and the pattern is unmistakable. Act 1, the product era, boxed. Buy the thing, own it, use it alone. Act 2, the service era, the cloud. Subscribe to capabilities. Updates are constant. Still use it, but mostly solo. Act 3, the network era. Collaboration. Join a live workspace. Create it together. Value compounds with each additional participant, the network effect. Let's talk about that, because I thought that is just a generification or a template that every organization can see themselves through. One of the examples you give, for example, is John Deere.
Yeah, I mean, Sangeet and I both love John Deere because in our work, what happened is with senior executive, they always say that, but this doesn't apply to me. I make heavy machine. What does Adobe have anything to do with me? But as we dig deeper, that logic of moving away from just selling boxes or product into services and then owning the workflow because now you have the network is actually true in even farming equipment. Now, John Deere is not the only game in town, but they're very successful compared to International Harvester, for instance. And so this is a story, of course, it's not just farming equipment like tractor, right? It applies also to cars as well. But going back to farming equipment, if you think about John Deere, right? Act 1, by the way, they've been around for more than a century as well. And if the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, has been disrupted by the Japanese, how come companies like Komatsu or Sumitomo couldn't kill John Deere? So it is a story of leap all over. Now, historically, what happened, of course, is this idea they make really good tractor. That's act number 1. You have to start with a strong product. But over time, what they have discovered is farmers love your tractor, but what they care the most is about the farm yield of the individual farm. Because I buy a tractor in order to grow better crops so that I could earn more money. So over time, what they have done is to build a digital dashboard to do what people call precision farming. So depending on the soil composition, weather forecast, etc., would recommend farmer what you should do. What kind of fertilizer from, Syngenta, seeds and fertilizer, whatnot. Give those all pesticides as well to do precision farming so that your yield rate is higher. You don't need to use so much fertilizer, save costs and good for the environment. But as Sangeet would point out in Reshuffle as well, what they have noticed and really smart about is now we have actually millions of tractors out in the farm. Each of them are collecting enormous amount of behavioral data. Not just farmer, not just buying data, buying behavior, but soil composition around the world. So what happened is you could almost see we are running thousands, if not tens of thousands of experiments real time everywhere. What works in Western Australia may be equivalent depending on the soil composition in places like South Asia. And so that recommendation could actually be transferable. And not just that. Once you feel every tractor becomes a data source out there, then we could talk about owning the workflow, orchestrating the workflow, and opening it up for seeds company, fertilizing company, chemical companies to participate in that ecosystem. So what is interesting is what applied to Figma and Adobe actually apply to as old as we think, as traditional as we thought, as farming equipment too.
I think this is what you do brilliantly as the sommeliers of content, is that you go, okay, here's the lessons from that thing. It may have nothing to do with you, or so you think, but this is the way the world has been reshuffled. And this is how you now have to look at work, the unit of work, how the supply side works, the demand side works, etc. But let's share the idea, because it was you who wrote about the unbundling and rebundling of, say, Spotify, of albums, for example. This unbundling has a dramatic effect on how we even treat work in the future.
It absolutely does. And I think the idea of unbundling and rebundling, if we were to very visually think of it, the simplest way to think about it is what happened in the music industry. Traditionally, music was distributed around the logic of the album. So in order to sell music, because it had to be stamped onto a physical device and that had all the costs of running through a physical supply chain, selling just one song did not make sense. And an artist would bring out an album and most people would like one or two of those songs. In order to really charge a hefty price for the album, they had to really sell the whole album. So the logic was around the entire album as a single unit, and that is because the distribution was structured around the constraints of physical distribution. When the constraint of physical distribution went away, which meant that the marginal cost of distribution went to zero, you could just upload a file on the internet and you had access to a global audience. There was no longer a need to stick to the logic of the album. And so the album got unbundled. The bundle of the album went away because it was really the physical distribution constraint that was holding it together. Once unconstrained, music spread around because of Napster, etc. And there were many other players who came in to try to make money once music got unbundled. But the problem is that you have to bundle it back with some other complementary capabilities to make money. So the first attempt at that happened with Steve Jobs, who essentially allowed music to be sold at $1, but then bundled it with a very valuable piece of hardware. So as long as the music was cheap, you wanted to pay a premium for the nice listening experience of the iPod. So what you were buying was not access to the music, but easy access to the music and easy management of the music, because getting it from file sharing sites still involved, risk of viruses and management problems, but also potential piracy lawsuits if you were really unlucky. But then eventually the real rebundling of music happened with Spotify, where they launched playlists, and playlists essentially are not structured around the logic of the production side, which is the artist or the label. It's structured around a mood. It's structured around a user can create their own playlist. It's structured around the user's preference. And so every dynamic collection of songs coming together on Spotify, made for you, or summer chill or whatever, these are all different playlists around different themes, all consumption side themes. So that's the idea of shifting from one bundle, unbundling it, and now rebundling it. And the reason most rebundling in music is consumption side, because we are in an attention economy where it's not so much the volume of music that's a problem, it's the relevance of music that's more important. And so this idea of unbundling, rebundling is a very nice visual to think about how any system changes. Because when we think about this concept of every system, whether it's an organization, whether it's a workflow, or whether it's an entire industry and a set of firms working together in what is called a business ecosystem, any of these systems are essentially structured around a certain logic. And when that logic goes away, that structure gets unbundled. Those components fall apart. And then with the new technology, there's an opportunity to rebundle that entire structure. So the example I'll take over here, which is very interesting because you did mention legal tech, but I feel a related, even more interesting example is fashion. And since Howard mentioned fashion, I want to take the example of Shein, which is a Chinese fashion juggernaut. Folks in Milan would balk at me calling them fashion, but here they are. In business, good enough is more important than perfect. And Shein is good enough to take a lot of business away from traditional fashion. Now, the way traditional fashion used to work was with the logic of a certain bundle, which was the bundle of mass production of an entire seasonal catalog, which is what Howard just talked about some time back. And the reason you needed mass production and seasonal catalog was because it was expensive to capture data about what customers want. It was expensive to translate into what designs would look like. And it was expensive to then bring it out to market. And so in order to do that, you wanted to really send merchandisers to Tokyo, Milan, etc., LA, and then figure out what was happening, what was the pulse, come back, sit with designers, work through 3 months, and then come out with these designs which you were then confident of, you had tested in some way, and now you could really fund large batch productions. Now, what happens is that, just as I talked about the rise of cloud computing and then algorithmic capabilities and AI, Shein essentially takes those technologies and applies that to the fashion world. And so just like the rise of the internet changed or unconstrained the logic of the album, the rise of cloud connectivity with AI unconstrains the logic of fashion. And so what Shein does is the first unconstraining that happens is because it captures data directly from social media. Every time you're scrolling, liking something, there's a constant stream of data coming in. So you no longer need to send a merchandiser to location X. Shein is constantly capturing that data. And on the basis of that, it's creating its own algorithmic heuristics in terms of which designs would work, which ones will not work. As it learns from the data, it's actually absorbing knowledge and logic about design. And so it breaks down the design and sends it to its on-demand network of designers who then come back with executing those designs, which it then puts out as micro production orders to its network of on-demand production plants. So it's not these big production runs that are being run. These are very small micro orders, sometimes 100 units or a really small number. Get it out, ship it out cheaply, test it in the market. And if it works, then you increase the production side. If it doesn't work, you're constantly churning out new design ideas anyway. So the logic completely changes. And what ends up happening is you have now unbundled and rebundled manufacturing in a fundamentally new way, market sensing in a fundamentally new way. But you also change the job of a designer in a fundamentally new way, because in the past, all of this logic of what should be the next fall collection or summer collection was sitting as tacit knowledge in the head of the designer. What happens with Shein is every time they run a small batch, they get data about what's working. Their algorithm learns from that. They put out another batch, the algorithm learns again. The more the algorithm learns, the more it can take away what was traditionally the designer's discretion. So increasingly, design becomes a set of micro tasks that much less sophisticated designers can handle as part of Shein's network. So that's really interesting because it possibly won't substitute all of a high-end fashion catalog, but it will start substituting a significant part of it. And as the algorithm improves, it substitutes that even further. So that's why I really find that a fascinating example.
I smell a blog coming, man. I smell a blog coming.
It's there in Reshuffle. There are 2 chapters dedicated to Shein.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. Howard.
What I love about this example is it's very easy, again, for manager to say, oh, but Shein couldn't disrupt the big companies like Uniqlo or Zara. Maybe not. But it is about a new way of thinking about managerial activities. Because before Shein, the biggest one is Zara when it comes down to rapid speed. Because what Zara have disrupt H&M is that they use their store to have this rapid feedback. So they always do small batch already because they love onshoring, doing manufacturing here in Europe, so that their supply chain is actually much shorter than some of the traditional like United Benetton of the world. So that once the moment the store manager feels that, hey, what kind of SKU is selling fast, then immediately would feed back to the manufacturing site to come up with another round of patches and to make improvement along the way. But what Sangeet just mentioned, because of the modularity, because of the coordination through the internet plus AI and social media at the same time, basically put a Zara logic to supercharge. Now, we are not saying Shein is going to dominate the world, and of course it has all these controversy when it comes down to sustainability. But I think for practicing manager is, oh, if that logic can apply to John Deere and also apply to fashion, but also apply to software, oh my God, I better pay a little bit of attention so that the kind of capability I need to do will start today. Things like if everything is still on PDF circulating around the organization, if we find ourselves every coordination comes down to email and telephone call, we are not future ready. And so it's not about becoming like Figma, but it's 1 inch ahead so that you are ahead of your direct competition. And that would allow you to have room for improvement. And that's really it. It's really practical.
What I find so interesting with the work is that people, it's out there what to do. I mean, people like you're sharing what to do, but people are so stuck in the way we have done it before. It's like the people in power and organizations have the old way of doing things. And it's not just an unbundling of content or the product. It's an unbundling of how we used to do it and rebundle it back that's fit for purpose today. That's the biggest stickler. I love your thoughts on that because that's where people get most stuck.
Yeah, I think, there's a difference between knowing what to do and believing in it. And people often say that, the difference is that we can't do it or we are structured in this way versus not. And a lot of that essentially means we don't believe in this enough to fundamentally unbundle and rebundle what we do because we don't believe in the outcome that we're going to get at the end of it enough. So I think that's really what keeps coming back to what we call the slow incumbent philosophy. It's not that incumbents are necessarily themselves slow. It's that this whole idea of if we are to reimagine what our business is going to be like, we have to start with thinking about what is first the future playing field going to look like, right? Is value still going to be at the places where it is today? And if that's the case, then we don't need to change because we already sit where the value is. But if value is going to move away, think of Kodak. Will value still be in printing photos? Well, no, it's going to move to sharing photos. So if value is going to move to sharing photos and you have 1,000 people R&D team which is focused on chemicals and not on social networking and cloud computing, then your R&D no longer applies to this new playing field. In that sense, you can do 2 things. And this is a discussion that Howard and I have had before, which is that when you see value moving away, you can either rethink what new capabilities need to come in because you now decide that you want to chase that value and hence you want to figure out what's the new game in order to capture that value because you can't play the same old game and play at another part of the value chain. So you have to rethink your game and in response, rethink your capability stack. Should we abandon something? Should we double down on something? Should we acquire new capabilities? And that's possibly what Kodak could have done. But what's really interesting is what Fujifilm did, because every consultant will come in and say Kodak could have been the next Instagram if they had invested in A, B, C, D. Well, the thing is, Kodak had started thinking about those things way before, but it was stuck with its 1,000-member R&D team, which was focused on chemicals. There was not sufficient incentive or sufficient time to transformation to completely change that. What Fujifilm did was very interesting. It essentially said, value is moving away in our playing field of photos, but our capabilities are sitting right here. We are really good at chemicals. Why don't we look for new playing fields where those chemicals still hold value? So using the same chemicals that I use for photography, they went into pharmaceuticals, they went into cosmetics, they moved across industries, taking the same capabilities. So I think it's really important as an executive, when you think about unbundling and rebundling, you have to think about it at 3 levels. First, look at the playing field. Which playing field do we want to play in? If we are in printing photos, do we want to continue printing photos? Do we want to go into sharing photos? Do we go into cosmetics? What's the playing field we want to play in? And accordingly, what's the new game if that's the playing field that we are aiming for? And with that, once we bet on the game, what's the capability stack that needs to come in place in order to win there? And that's where the unbundling, rebundling happens at all those levels, starting with your mindset to thinking about unbundling and rebundling the industry structure, the playing field itself, going back into unbundling and rebundling your business model, and then your capability stack.
Beautifully said, man. Maybe we'll give a lesson that you both really derived from this to jump from Act 2 to Act 3. Howard, in your article on this, you say, if you want the Figma style upside without becoming someone else's cautionary tale, 1 is kill the file, 2 is shift the value to orchestration, 3 is track the right scoreboard, 4, open the edges, and 5, make work multiplayer. I'd love you to take us through these at a high level, and then Sangeet, your version of what that is in an AI world and how that reshuffles everything.
Yeah, so I think what Sangeet just mentioned about how Fujifilm make it is that you've got to think for yourself, starting where you are, because a company administrative heritage, where we started, determines everything. So if we are talking about, say, a family-owned business, very traditional, making ball bearings, for instance, a B2B companies, well, you cannot become Figma overnight. That would be too crazy. But what is needed is to looking at, hey, internally, do we still do all the manual coordination? When from product development to sales, is it still passing along PDF that no one knows which version of truth it is? If that is the issue, then we need to fix the basic. So maybe embrace culturally a sense of transparency. Now notice that Figma, when you deploy that software inside a company like Spotify, everyone would be able to see what is being worked on. There is no hiding away. It's full transparency as a result of accountability. So we've got to start with where we are. Now, if a company already is okay using a lot of Google document, having shared drive and things like that, then that's great. So then start thinking about, do everyone have access to the kind of data and they could run experiment like a 22-year-old that I could run a combined with market data, external trend data, running an AI experiment and report back to senior management team within a week of new findings. Now, if this is a company require 5 approval forms, then culturally, again, we need to solve that issue first, because any transformation die among permission form. It's never about lacking foresight, because once the top management team have gone through deep thinking enough, it oftentimes comes down to the day-to-day barrier we need to break. Now imagine this is company culturally is also ready. So then what's next? Well, we better start thinking about what Sangeet mentioned, opening up our enterprise through API, application programming interface, so that you could start with a low-cost experiment to orchestrate among the ecosystem partner. And then these would be the tangible step coming along the way. And one last thing, your proprietary data. Think about what are the additional data exhaust you can capture. And this is really key. If you have a website, make sure you track all the click rate, all the click range along the way. If you have a physical footprint, do we have enough camera to capture customer footprint and anonymize them, but you know the heat map. And then think about, hey, what is my more expensive data capturing that are valuable to us? Almost like Google Map that they send people to capture street view in your industry. Is it the footage of a factory, digital twin of the world? Is it about your retailing or even a bookstore? And then you could triangulate data. So these are fundamental, very concrete steps that move us away from just the Act 1 product to Act 2, more like cloud-based and share information and transparency. Into Act 3 really is opening up to the external ecosystem and be part of that automated workflow.
Man, I tell you, when I read these pieces as well, because people go, oh, that doesn't apply to me. I was thinking about even how I can do that for this show and break open the content and unbundle it so it's more accessible and indexable and all this kind of stuff. There's so much we can apply to our own worlds at every level, and this is why this is so valuable. Sangeet, for you, the takeaways from this, because you give some takeaways at the end of this article that you really want people to think about this, that go, okay, this isn't about Figma and Adobe, this is about you and the great reshuffling that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. My take on this is very complementary to the take that Howard just presented. And it's very central to my message in Reshuffle as well, which is that you have to start with assuming that the reshuffle is going to happen, and it's already happening, because the pace of external forces playing upon your business, but also upon your industry structure, is constantly increasing. There are many more converging forces coming in. And what that does is, traditionally, when we think about what should our company do, what should our company strategy be, we would usually boil it down to two simple questions. Where do we play and how do we win? But in that world, the logic of the game was very static. So very often when we said, where do we play? The answers were things like, which market do we enter? Which customers do we serve? Which new products do we launch? And how do we win was essentially about how do we retain customers better? How do we serve them and upsell, etc. Today, the answers are very different. The questions are more like, what are the boundaries of our ecosystem? Because the boundaries of our industry don't apply anymore. And what should we subsidize in order to make money somewhere else, so that our subsidies kill the competition because they're making money over there? So where do we play? How do we win is fundamentally different. And this is why a lot of management, I would say, theory or simple rules of thumb that emerged in the late 80s and 90s no longer apply. I'll give a very, very simple example. People still use the idea of a first mover advantage. A first mover advantage only applies when the structure is stable and your way to play is things like which market, which product category, which customer segment. If the structure is stable, the first mover will win because the rules are stable. If the structure is not stable, if you don't know how cloud computing is going to change design, the first mover is not going to win, simply because the first mover will take all the arrows on the back to prove out the structure for the next players to come in and win. So it's not like the first mover never wins. They had always won in a stable structure. Today, with an unstable structure, the second mover or third mover advantage is not a bug, it's a feature. And hence we should move away from that logic. So my key point is that when the structure is unstable like this, the only way you can thrive in this kind of an environment is to constantly go outside in and inside out. When you go outside in, you constantly ask yourself, how are the rules of competition changing? If AI is coming in, what was our basis of competition in the past? A lot of the knowledge economy is structured on a simple basis of competition. Knowledge is expensive and difficult to acquire. You either have to go to Harvard or you have to bring in people who are less trained and make them more trained. And so one way or the other, it's expensive to get access to knowledge work. But if AI changes the economics of knowledge work, makes it one prompt away, how does then the logic of competition of the industry change? And AI is just one force. There are many forces. How is the logic of competition changing externally? In response to that, how should we reorganize in order to compete? And what new capabilities should we be bringing in? What old capabilities should we retain versus abandon? So you have to rethink your capabilities, your workflows, your organizational systems in light of that. On the other side, if you look at companies like Tesla, for instance, what you'll also realize is that because the structure is in flux, you are in a position to set the new game for everybody else if you are proactive about your capabilities and use it to create new innovation through which you change the rules of competition for everyone else. And that's what, for example, Tesla did by being the only player in the US really to combine the two complementary capabilities of vehicle manufacturing and electrical charging, and everybody else left electrical charging to other players. So it's important to then know how can you create a new capability set that will change the logic of the industry. Today, Tesla has set the standard for vehicle charging in the US. It has run into other issues, and Howard is the master on this, on how BYD flipped the script on Tesla. But really, the message that you take away from this is that when the structure of your playing field and your game are both up for grabs, the best way to win is not to get really good at playing the old game, but to change the game for everybody else because the structure is up for grabs. And I think that's something that's really, really powerful.
And we saw this in the country level, I think, in the automotive industry. The only reason the Chinese finally can enter the global auto industry is because of that fracture, moving away from internal combustion engine into electric motor. And then as a result, the Chinese always are very strong on electronics. And this is where at the country level, we see that getting expressed at the same time. So
I smell another episode coming, guys. I smell another episode. I'd love to do a deep dive on those as well. And there's so much more. I enjoyed the article, Howard, you wrote about responsible AI. And it's not what people think. And we're going to point people where to find that work. But I'd love to come back and do an episode on the great reshuffling we're seeing in the automotive industry because it's fascinating. And again, it was like this article, both of you took the Figma and the Adobe story and you took it from different aspects, Tesla and BYD as well. So guys, for people who want to find you, I'll link to this, but where's the best place to find you? Howard, for example.
On the Substack is really having a lot of the information. For the nerdy one, of course, from Substack would bring you to our Future Readiness Center with all the research method. But I would always say, just search for Howard Yu 1 inch ahead. That's a Substack title.
And Sangeet, where's the best place to find you, man?
It's again the Substack. It's called Platforms. It's plural platforms.substack.com. Don't go to platform.substack.com. That's owned by Substack for their own platform. It's platforms.substack. And then you can check out my new book, Reshuffle, which essentially talks about all of these ideas.
And I have the great privilege to be doing deep dives on both those books, on Leap by Howard and on Reshuffle by Sangeet. And I'm going to cover Platform Revolution as well, because this is another stomper of a read to understand. We're going to do a whole series on platforms in the latter half of next year as well to go deep dive on platforms. Gents, it's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to meeting you. I think we're going to meet hopefully in London at the Thinkers 50 as well. Meet and shake your hands, and I look forward to future collaboration as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. Howard Yu and Sangeet Paul Choudary, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Aidan.
As always, thank you to Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute, where you'll find a plethora of beautiful content, many of the guests who have been on the show and will be on the show in the future, at kyndryl.com/institute.